The Tuesday morning air in downtown Financial District was crisp, smelling of ambition and expensive cologne. Richard Sterling breathed it in like it was his own personal oxygen supply. His suit, a tailored charcoal grey by Tom Ford, felt less like clothing and more like a second skin, a testament to his station. His shoes, polished to a mirror shine, clicked a rhythm of importance on the marble floors of the Sterling Tower lobby, a building his grandfather had built and which he now commanded. He was 34 years old, with a jawline carved from granite and eyes the colour of a winter sky, cold and assessing. He saw the world not as a collection of people, but as a series of assets and liabilities. He pushed through the revolving glass doors of The Gilded Spoon, a cafe that catered to the city's elite. It was his usual spot for a pre-market coffee, a place where the baristas knew his order and the patrons knew his name. He didn't greet the hostess. He simply gestured towards his preferred booth in the corner, the one with the best view of the street, and expected her to understand. She did, of course. Everyone understood Richard Sterling. He slid into the plush leather, placing his platinum credit card on the table as a silent announcement. "I am here. I am important. Do not waste my time." He pulled out his phone, a sleek black slab of technology, and began scrolling through market reports. The world was a game of numbers, and he was winning. A young woman approached his table. She was new. He could tell instantly. The usual waitress, an older woman named Maria, had a practiced invisibility. This one, her name tag read Sarah, had an earnestness about her that he found irritating. She had tired eyes but a polite, forced smile. He could see the faint outline of a faded cartoon bandage on her wrist, peeking from under her sleeve. A single mother, he guessed. A liability. "Good morning, sir. Can I get you started with something?" she asked, her voice soft. He didn't look up from his phone. "A large black Americano, extra hot. And be quick about it. I have a 7-figure deal to close before the opening bell." He said it not to inform her, but to remind her of the chasm that existed between their lives. "Of course, sir. Right away," Sarah replied, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second before she regained her composure and hurried away. Richard watched her go, a flicker of contempt in his eyes. He despised weakness, and to him, service was the ultimate form of it. These people, scurrying around to fulfill the whims of their betters, were like ants, necessary but insignificant. His phone buzzed. It was a text from his broker. "The Harrison deal is a go. Contracts are ready. Celebration is in order." A slow, predatory smile spread across Richard's face. The Harrison deal was the culmination of 6 months of ruthless negotiation. It would cement his reputation as the most formidable player in the city. He felt a surge of pure, unadulterated power. He was a king, and this cafe, this city, was his kingdom. Sarah returned a few minutes later, carefully balancing a steaming ceramic mug. She placed it on the table with a small coaster. "Your Americano, sir, extra hot." Richard finally put his phone down. He picked up the mug, his fingers wrapping around the heated ceramic. He brought it to his lips, took a tentative sip, and then his face contorted into a mask of disgust. He slammed the mug back down on the table, coffee sloshing over the rim. "What is this?" he snapped, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the cafe. Sarah flinched. I'm sorry, sir. It's the Americano you ordered." "This is not extra hot," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "This is lukewarm dishwater. Are you incapable of following a simple instruction? Is your job really that difficult?" Heads were starting to turn. An elderly man in the adjacent booth, reading a newspaper, lowered it slightly, his brow furrowed. Sarah's face flushed with color. "I apologize, sir. I watched the barista make it." The steam was coming right off the machine. "I can get you another one." "You can get me another one." Richard mimicked her in a high, mocking tone. "I don't have time for you to get me another one. I have a multi-million-dollar acquisition to finalize. My time is worth more than your entire year's salary. Do you understand that?" Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, but she held them back. "Yes, sir. I'm very sorry." It was her apology, her quiet submission, that ignited the final spark of cruelty in him. He wanted to do more than just scold her. He wanted to mark her with his superiority, to leave a brand of his importance on her insignificant life. He wanted to see her break. With a look of utter disdain, he picked up the mug again. "Let me show you what happens when you waste my time," he said, his voice chillingly calm. And then he did it. He deliberately, slowly poured the entire contents of the hot coffee mug onto the floor, right next to her feet, splashing the scalding liquid onto her black work slacks and sensible shoes. Sarah cried out, a sharp gasp of pain and shock as the heat soaked through the fabric and seared her skin. She stumbled backward, clutching her leg. The cafe fell silent. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of the coffee pooling on the polished floor. Richard Sterling looked at her, a whimpering, wounded animal, and he laughed. It wasn't a loud, boisterous laugh. It was a short, sharp bark of amusement. A cold, dismissive chuckle that said, "Look at this pathetic creature. Look at what I can do." He reached into his wallet, pulled out a $100 bill, and tossed it onto the table. "For the coffee," he said with a smirk, "and for the trouble of cleaning up your mess." He stood up, adjusted his tie, and strode towards the exit without a backward glance, leaving behind a silent, horrified cafe, a weeping waitress, and a puddle of dark, bitter coffee cooling on the floor. He felt invincible. He had just conquered the business world, and for an encore, he had crushed a nobody. It was, in his mind, a perfect morning. As Richard Sterling stepped out of the Gilded Spoon and back into the crisp morning air, the adrenaline of his petty victory still coursed through him. He felt cleansed, as if he had purged some minor annoyance from his system. The girl's cry of pain was a distant, satisfying echo. He checked his watch, a Patek Philippe that cost more than her car, if she even had one. He was still on schedule. Power was efficiency, and he was the model of both. He walked the half-block to the Sterling Towers' private garage, the confident click of his shoes announcing his arrival. He nodded curtly to the security guard, who scrambled to attention. Richard ignored him, his mind already on the Harrison deal. He imagined the press release, the envy in his rival's eyes, the grudging respect from his own father. Inside the climate-controlled silence of his Bentley, he felt the world reset to its proper order. He was insulated, protected, untouchable. He started the engine, a low, powerful purr that vibrated through the leather seats. He was about to pull out of his reserved spot when his phone rang. It was his private line. The caller ID read, Marcus Thorne. Marcus was his senior partner, a man who had been with his father's firm for 30 years. He was usually unflappable, but Richard detected a strange, tight quality in his voice. "Richard," Marcus said, dispensing with the usual pleasantries. "We have a problem." Richard scoffed. "Marcus, the only problem we have is where to display the trophy from the Harrison deal. The contracts are signed." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Not anymore," Marcus said, his voice grave. "I just got off the phone with Mr. Harrison's legal counsel. He's invoking the character and reputational risk clause. He's pulling out. The deal is dead." The engine's purr suddenly seemed deafening. Richard's blood ran cold. "What? That's impossible. The clause is a boilerplate formality. No one ever uses it." "What reason did they give?" "They were specific," Marcus said, and Richard could hear the discomfort in his voice. "They cited an appalling public display of cruelty and a complete lack of basic human decency by a key principle of our firm." "Richard, what did you do this morning?" Richard's mind raced back to the cafe. The girl, the coffee, the laugh. It couldn't be. It was a nobody, a waitress. "I had a minor issue with a waitress at a coffee shop. It was nothing." "It wasn't nothing to Mr. Harrison," Marcus shot back, his voice now laced with ice. "He was there, Richard. He saw the whole thing. He said he wouldn't do business with a man who finds sport in tormenting the working class. He called you a moral bankrupt." Those were his exact words. The name on the deal suddenly clicked into place. Harrison. A common enough name, but still. Richard pictured the old man in the adjacent booth, the one with the newspaper. He had looked quiet, unassuming. Just another old man with time to kill. He had grossly, catastrophically misjudged him. "Marcus, I can fix this," Richard said, his voice desperate, the earlier arrogance evaporating into sheer panic. "I'll call him. I'll apologize." "It's too late," Marcus said, his tone funereal. "The kill order has been sent to the press. The story is that Sterling Corp has been dropped over ethical concerns. The fallout from this will be catastrophic. Our stock will plummet at the opening bell. Richard, your father is on his way to the office. He's calling an emergency board meeting. The line went dead. Richard stared at the phone in his hand. It felt alien, a harbinger of doom. The seven-figure deal wasn't just closed, it was annihilated. And he was the one who had lit the fuse. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. This was a nightmare, a temporary, fixable nightmare. He just needed to get to the office, talk to his father, smooth things over. He was Richard Sterling. He fixed things. He slammed the Bentley into drive and peeled out of the garage, his tires screeching in protest. As he sped through the downtown streets, his phone buzzed again. A text alert from his bank. Fraud alert. Your accounts have been temporarily frozen, pending an investigation into unusual activity. What the hell, he muttered, his heart hammering against his ribs. He tried to open his banking app. Access denied. He tried another. Access denied. A cold dread, unfamiliar and terrifying, began to creep up his spine. This wasn't just about the Harrison deal anymore. This felt coordinated. This felt like an attack. He was 2 blocks from the Sterling Tower when he saw it. A news van was parked out front, then another. Reporters were swarming the entrance, cameras and microphones at the ready. His phone buzzed again, this time a news alert from a major financial publication. The headline seared itself into his brain. Sterling Corp implodes, CEO's son cited in ethics, scandal as billion-dollar Harrison deal collapses. He couldn't go in there. He couldn't face them. He wrenched the wheel, turning sharply down a side street, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. He needed to think, to find a quiet place to regroup. He decided to head home, to the sanctuary of his penthouse apartment. He pulled into the private entrance of his luxury high-rise, the Pinnacle. As he stepped out of his car, the valet, a young man named Leo, who usually greeted him with a deferential smile, simply stared at him with a look of pity. "Mr. Sterling," Leo began, but didn't seem to know what to say. Richard brushed past him and headed for the private elevator. He swiped his keycard. A red light blinked. Access denied. He tried again. Access denied. "What is going on?" he snarled, turning back to the valet. Just then, the building manager, a stern woman named Ms. Albright, emerged from her office holding a tablet. She didn't meet his eyes. "Richard," she said, using his first name for the first time ever, "I'm afraid there's been a change in your residency status. The building's owner was notified of a serious breach of the morality clause in your lease agreement." Richard stared at her, dumbfounded. "The morality clause? Who the hell is the owner?" Ms. Albright finally looked at him, her expression unreadable. "His name is Alistair Harrison." The name hit him like a physical blow. The old man in the cafe didn't just witness his cruelty, he owned the very building Richard called home. He had been living on his enemy's land. "Effective immediately," Ms. Albright continued, reading from her tablet in a monotone voice. "Your lease is terminated. Your access has been revoked. A security team is currently in your penthouse packing your personal belongings. They will be placed in storage, the details of which will be forwarded to you at a later date. You are required to vacate the premises immediately." "You can't do this," Richard yelled, his voice cracking. "All my things are up there, my money, my cards, my life." "Your platinum card was on the table at the cafe this morning, was it not?" she asked coolly. "Mr. Harrison's associate took the liberty of having it, and all associated accounts cancelled. As per the terms of your lease, which you signed, the owner reserves the right to take swift action to protect the reputation of his property." He was locked out of his home. His accounts were frozen. His career was in flames. It had been less than 30 minutes since he had walked out of the Gilded Spoon, feeling like a god. Now he was standing in the garage of a building he could no longer enter, with nothing but the clothes on his back and a useless phone in his hand. The laughter had died in his throat, replaced by the bitter taste of ash. He was no longer a king. He wasn't even a man. He was just a liability. The world had shrunk to the size of the pavement beneath Richard Sterling's feet. The symphony of the city, the traffic, the distant sirens, the chatter of passers-by, which had once been the soundtrack to his success, now sounded like a mocking chorus. He stood on the sidewalk across from the Pinnacle, his former home, watching as two uniformed security guards escorted a bewildered-looking delivery man away from the entrance. The building, his sanctuary, was now a fortress sealed against him. He felt a primal urge to scream, to rage against the injustice of it all. But who would he scream at? An old man he had underestimated. A system that he had manipulated for years, which had now turned on him with terrifying efficiency. He had built his life on the principle of cause and effect, of action and consequence, but he had always been the cause, and others had always suffered the consequence. Now the roles were reversed, and the whiplash was nauseating. His phone was little more than a brick. The news alerts had stopped, likely because his data plan, tied to a now cancelled credit card, had been cut off. He was digitally excommunicated. He tried to think of who to call, who could help him. He scrolled through his contacts, a long list of names that represented power and influence. He started with his lawyer, a shark named Peterson. He found a payphone, a relic he hadn't used in 20 years, and fumbled with the few coins he found in his pocket. The call went to voicemail. "Peterson, it's Richard Sterling. It's an emergency. Harrison is trying to ruin me. Call me back immediately." He left his number, then realized with a jolt of despair that the phone couldn't receive calls. He tried his father. The call was picked up on the first ring. "Dad, thank God," Richard said, relief washing over him. "Do not call this number again," the voice on the other end said. It was his father's personal assistant, a man who had known Richard since he was a boy. The voice was cold, devoid of any familiarity. "What? Put him on the phone right now," Richard demanded. "Mr. Sterling Sr. has instructed me to inform you that you are no longer an employee of Sterling Corp. You are no longer a signatory on any family accounts. Your actions this morning have cost this family over $1 billion in market value and have brought shame upon the Sterling name. He considers your relationship terminated. Goodbye, Richard." The line went dead. Terminated. The word echoed in the hollow space where his confidence used to be. His own father had cut him off. Not just fired him, but disowned him. The foundation of his entire identity, his name, his wealth, his legacy, had been dynamited. He stumbled away from the payphone, a strange lightness in his head. The sun was climbing higher, and the city was bustling with lunchtime crowds. Men in suits like his own strode past, talking animatedly on their phones, hailing cabs, living the life that had been his only an hour ago. He was invisible to them now. Or worse, he was a spectacle, a man in a $1,000 suit standing dazed on a street corner, looking utterly lost. Hunger, an unfamiliar sensation, began to gnaw at his stomach. He had skipped breakfast in his rush. He patted his pockets. The $100 bill he'd thrown on the table at the cafe was the last of his cash. He had nothing. He began to walk, with no destination in mind. He was a ghost haunting his own city. He passed restaurants where he had conducted power lunches, the scent of grilled steak and fine wine wafting out. A cruel reminder of his former life. He saw a woman laughing with her friends, and the sound was like glass grinding in his ears. His own laughter, so recent and so cruel, had cost him everything. As afternoon bled into evening, a new enemy emerged, the cold. The crisp morning had given way to a biting wind that whipped through the canyons of steel and glass. His fine wool suit, designed for the short walk from a heated car to a heated building, offered little protection. He shivered, pulling the jacket tighter around himself. He found himself in a part of the city he had only ever driven through, a grittier neighborhood where the storefronts were faded and the people's faces were etched with struggles he had never imagined. Here, his suit was not a symbol of power, but a target. He drew suspicious glares, and a man with hollow eyes followed him for 2 blocks, making him cross the street in a panic. Fear, raw and visceral, was another new acquaintance. Night fell. The city transformed into a glittering tapestry of lights, but for Richard it was a cold, indifferent universe. He was tired, his expensive shoes pinching his feet, his body aching with a weariness that went beyond muscle. It was a soul-deep exhaustion. He needed to rest, but where? He couldn't check into a hotel. He couldn't call a cab. He found a small, recessed alcove outside a closed bookstore. It offered minimal shelter from the wind. He sank down onto the cold concrete, pulling his knees to his chest. The shame was a physical weight pressing down on him, crushing the air from his lungs. He thought of Sarah, the waitress. He replayed the scene in his mind, not with the smug satisfaction of before, but with a dawning, sickening horror. He saw her flinch. He heard her cry of pain. He saw the tears she had fought to hold back. He had done that. He, Richard Sterling, had taken pleasure in inflicting pain on a defenseless person. And the universe, in the form of a quiet old man with a newspaper, had judged him. The sentence was swift and absolute. He closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. The sounds of the night were amplified, the wail of a distant ambulance, the drunken shouts of a group stumbling out of a bar, the rustle of trash blowing down the empty street. He felt a tremor of pure terror. He was alone. He was nothing. Stripped of his name, his money, and his power, what was left of Richard Sterling? He didn't know the answer, and that was the most terrifying thing of all. He had poured hot coffee and laughed. Now the world had poured ice water on his life, and there was no one left to hear him scream. The first light of dawn was a dirty grey, filtering through the urban haze and illuminating the grim reality of Richard's new existence. He had dozed fitfully, his body contorted on the cold concrete, his dreams a chaotic slideshow of angry faces and locked doors. He awoke with a stiff neck and a profound bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. His tailored suit was now a wrinkled, grimy mess. A smear of dirt stained the knee of his trousers. He looked like a parody of his former self. The city was slowly waking up, and with it his hunger returned, sharper and more demanding than the day before. It was a base, animal need that overrode everything else. He needed to eat. He needed money. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. He walked towards a bustling intersection where commuters were grabbing breakfast from street vendors. The smell of coffee and fried bacon was both tantalizing and torturous. He approached a man in a business suit, a younger version of himself, who was waiting for the light to change. "Excuse me," Richard began, his voice raspy. I seem to have lost my wallet. I just need a few dollars for breakfast." The man glanced at him, his eyes taking in the expensive but disheveled suit, the desperate look on his face. A flicker of suspicion crossed his features. "Sorry, pal," he said, turning away. "Can't help you." Richard tried again with a woman waiting for a bus. She clutched her purse tighter and shook her head without making eye contact. He tried a third time and a fourth. The reactions were all the same: suspicion, dismissal, fear. He was an anomaly they couldn't process. A well-dressed beggar. A man who looked like he belonged but clearly didn't. His very appearance, once his greatest asset, was now his biggest liability. Defeated, he slumped onto a bench in a small city park. He watched a flock of pigeons pecking at a discarded piece of bread. He felt a pang of envy for the birds. They knew how to survive in this world. He did not. His mind, once a finely tuned instrument for navigating complex financial markets, was now consumed with a single desperate problem: survival. How did people do this? How did they live without a safety net, without the effortless buffer of wealth? He had always viewed the poor and the homeless as a different species, a result of bad choices and personal failings. He never considered the sheer, grinding mechanics of it all. The constant search for food, for warmth, for a safe place to sleep, the overwhelming soul-crushing invisibility. Days began to blur into a monotonous cycle of misery. The first day was about shock. The second was about a desperate, failed attempt to reclaim his old life. By the third day, a grim acceptance began to set in. He learned to identify the places that offered a sliver of warmth. The steam grates on the subway, the public library where he could sit for hours without being bothered, pretending to read books his foggy mind couldn't comprehend. He learned about hunger. It wasn't just an empty feeling in his stomach, it was a constant dull ache that clouded his thoughts and sapped his will. He once saw a half-eaten sandwich in a trash can. He stared at it for a full minute, his stomach churning with a war between disgust and ravenous need. He walked away, but the image haunted him for hours. His appearance deteriorated rapidly. His once perfectly coiffed hair was now greasy and matted. A rough stubble shadowed his granite jawline. The Tom Ford suit, his armor, was now a tattered prison. He was becoming one of the ghosts he used to look straight through. One afternoon, seeking shelter from a sudden downpour, he ducked into the covered entrance of a large old church. A line of people, men and women with weary faces and worn-out clothes, were queuing up. A sign read, "St. Jude's Soup Kitchen, all are welcome." He hesitated. This was the ultimate admission of defeat, to stand in a line waiting for a handout. But the rain was cold, and the smell of hot soup wafting from the open door was an irresistible siren song. He joined the end of the line, keeping his head down, his face hidden by the collar of his jacket. Inside, the warmth was a blessing. He was handed a plastic tray with a bowl of steaming vegetable soup, a piece of bread, and a cup of water. He found an empty seat at a long communal table and ate with a ferocity that shamed him. He didn't taste the soup, he inhaled it. It was the first hot meal he'd had in 3 days. As he ate, he looked at the faces around him. They were faces etched with hardship, but they were also just faces. An old man was carefully saving half of his bread, wrapping it in a napkin. 2 women were talking quietly, one comforting the other. They were not a different species, they were people. People who had been dealt a bad hand, people who had made mistakes, people who had just been unlucky. For the first time, he didn't see them as liabilities or failures. He just saw them. The thought of Sarah returned to him, clearer than ever. He had looked at her and seen a nobody, a cog in the machine of his life. He hadn't seen the tired eyes of a mother working a thankless job. He hadn't considered the life attached to the hand that served him coffee. He had denied her humanity. And in return, the world had denied him his. He finished his soup and left the church, stepping back out into the rain-washed city. Something inside him had shifted. The panic was still there, the despair was still a heavy cloak, but it was now joined by a sliver of something else. Clarity. He hadn't just lost his money and his status. He had been stripped bare of the arrogance that had blinded him. He finally understood. The problem wasn't what had been done to him, the problem was what he had done. The coffee, the laugh. It wasn't a minor incident. It was the symptom of a rot that had consumed his entire soul. He knew what he had to do. It wasn't about getting his old life back. That life was a poisoned chalice. It was about facing the person he had been. He had to go back. He had to go back to the gilded spoon. He didn't know what he would say or do, but he knew he had to stand in the place where his world had ended and confront the ghost of the man he was. With a new, terrifying purpose, he started walking back towards the financial district, a tattered prince returning to the scene of his fall from grace. The journey back to the financial district was like a pilgrimage in reverse. Richard Sterling walked from the land of the forgotten back towards the kingdom he once ruled. Each block brought a subtle shift in the environment. The buildings grew taller and sleeker, the cars became more expensive, and the people moved with a sharper, more urgent pace. He was a foreign body in this ecosystem now, a piece of debris washed up on a pristine shore. People gave him a wide berth, their eyes flicking over his ragged form with a mixture of pity and disgust. He was a living, breathing reminder of the failure they all feared. He reached the street where the Gilded Spoon was located. From a block away, he could see its warm, inviting lights, a beacon of a life that was no longer his. His heart pounded a nervous, frantic rhythm against his ribs. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to retreat to the anonymous misery he had grown accustomed to. But the sliver of clarity he'd found in the soup kitchen had hardened into a resolve he didn't know he possessed. This was not about redemption. It was about penance. He stood across the street for a long time, hidden in the shadows of an adjacent building, watching. He saw men and women he recognized, rivals, former colleagues, strolling in and out, laughing, closing deals, living their lives. It was a world he was no longer a part of, separated from him by a pane of glass and an abyss of his own making. Then he saw her. Sarah was clearing a table near the window. Her movements were efficient, practiced. She wore the same black uniform, but he noticed she had a compression sleeve on her left arm, the one that had been splashed. A faint scar, red and angry, was visible just above her wrist, where the sleeve ended. The sight of it was a punch to his gut. It was a physical, lasting mark of his cruelty, a brand he had left on her. She wasn't weeping, she wasn't broken. She was working, She was surviving. She paused to share a brief warm smile with the elderly hostess, Maria, before moving to the next table. In that moment, she possessed a dignity and a strength that Richard had never known. He, who had commanded boardrooms and moved markets, felt like a pathetic, whimpering child in the face of her resilience. As he watched, the door opened and another figure entered. It was him, Alistair Harrison, the old man from the cafe. He wasn't dressed in a billionaire's power suit, but in the same simple, well-worn tweed jacket he'd had on that morning. He greeted Maria by name and took his usual booth, the one adjacent to where Richard had sat. Sarah approached his table and Richard held his breath, expecting to see fear or resentment in her eyes. Instead, she gave him a small, genuine smile. "The usual, Mr. Harrison?" she asked, her voice carrying a note of familiar warmth. "Please, Sarah," the old man replied, his own voice kind. "And how is young Lily's school project coming along?" "She finished it last night," Sarah said, her face lighting up. "A diorama of the solar system. She was so proud. Thank you again for the encyclopedia, it was a huge help." "Nonsense. A bright mind needs fuel," Harrison said with a gentle smile. "And how is the arm feeling today?" "Much better. The cream you recommended works wonders," she said, before heading off to get his order. Richard felt the ground shift beneath him. They knew each other. This wasn't just a random act of justice from a stranger. Harrison was a regular. He knew her daughter's name. He was invested in her life. Richard hadn't just insulted a random waitress in front of a powerful man. He had brutalized someone that this powerful man cared about right in front of his eyes. The sheer cosmic stupidity of his arrogance was staggering. This was his moment. It was now or never. He took a deep breath that smelled of street grime and desperation, and he crossed the street. Pushing open the heavy glass door of the Gilded Spoon was the hardest thing he had ever done. The little bell above the door chimed, announcing his arrival. Every head in the cafe turned. A collective gasp rippled through the room. They recognized him. The titan of industry, the disgraced son, now returned as a spectre. His former colleagues stared, their mouths agape. Maria, the hostess, looked at him with wide, frightened eyes. But Richard only had eyes for two people. He walked slowly, deliberately, towards the corner booth. His wet, tattered shoes made no sound on the polished floor. Sarah, who was returning with a teapot for Harrison, stopped dead in her tracks. The color drained from her face, and her hand instinctively went to her scarred arm. She looked at him with pure, unadulterated fear. He stopped a few feet from their table. He didn't speak. He couldn't. The words were lodged in his throat, a tangled mess of shame and regret. Alistair Harrison looked up from his newspaper, his gaze calm and steady. He showed no surprise, no anger. He simply watched, waited. Richard's eyes darted from Harrison's impassive face to Sarah's terrified one. He saw what he had done, reflected in her fear. He had been a monster. And monsters didn't deserve to speak. They deserved to be on a leash. His legs gave out. He fell to his knees on the hard floor. The sound of his kneecaps hitting the tiles echoed in the dead silence of the cafe. He lowered his head until his forehead touched the cold, unforgiving ground. And then the sounds came. They weren't words. They were guttural, animalistic sobs, torn from the very depths of his broken soul. He was no longer Richard Sterling, the master of the universe. He was a ruined thing, prostrate on the floor of a cafe, begging for a forgiveness he had no right to ask for. "I'm sorry," he finally choked out, his voice a ragged, unrecognizable whisper. The words were addressed to the floor, to the air, to Sarah. "Please, I'm so sorry." He stayed there on his knees, his body shaking with uncontrollable sobs. He wasn't performing. He wasn't strategizing. He had nothing left to gain. All he had was this single, horrifying moment of self-realization. He had poured hot coffee and laughed. And now, here he was, homeless, broken, and barking like a dog for a mercy he knew he would never receive. The silence in the Gilded Spoon was absolute, a thick, heavy blanket that smothered all other sounds. The patrons were frozen, their forks halfway to their mouths, their conversations dead in the air. They were witnessing the complete and utter disintegration of a man they had once envied or feared. Richard remained on the floor, a heap of expensive, ruined fabric and shuddering sobs, the raw sound of his despair the only thing moving in the room. Sarah stood paralyzed, the teapot still in her hand. Her fear was slowly being replaced by a bewildering mix of shock and a strange, unwelcome flicker of pity. The man she remembered was a towering figure of cold fury, a predator. This creature on the floor was something else entirely, a broken, pathetic thing. It was hard to reconcile the two. Alistair Harrison finally folded his newspaper and placed it neatly on the table. He looked down at the top of Richard's head, his expression unreadable. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of command, cutting through the silence. "Get up," he said. It was not a request. Richard flinched as if struck. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself up from the floor. He didn't rise to his full height, but remained in a low crouch, unable to meet anyone's eyes. He looked like an animal expecting a blow. "Look at me," Harrison commanded. With immense effort, Richard lifted his head. His face was a wreck. It was streaked with dirt and tears, his eyes bloodshot and hollowed out with exhaustion and shame. The granite jawline was covered in a scruffy, unkempt beard. He looked 10 years older and a lifetime defeated. "Do you know why you are here?" Harrison asked, his voice even. I'm sorry," Richard stammered again, the only words he seemed to know. "For what I did. To her. I was—" He trailed off, unable to find a word that could possibly describe the man he had been. "You were cruel," Harrison supplied, his voice sharp as a shard of glass. "You were arrogant. You believed that your wealth and your name made you immune to the basic rules of human decency. You saw people not as fellow souls, but as tools or obstacles. You saw this young woman, a single mother working 2 jobs to provide for her daughter, as nothing more than an insect to be crushed for your own amusement." Every word was a nail hammered into Richard's soul. He didn't deny it. He couldn't. He just nodded, a pathetic, jerky movement of his head. Harrison gestured towards Sarah. "This is Sarah Jenkins. Her daughter, Lily, is 7 years old. Sarah gets up at 5 o'clock every morning to get her daughter ready for school before taking a bus across town for her first job. She works here until 3, then takes another bus to her second job, cleaning offices, where she works until 10. She gets home just in time to kiss her sleeping daughter goodnight. The burn you gave her made it impossible for her to do her second job for a week, costing her money she desperately needed for rent, money you threw on the table like a tip." Richard's gaze flickered to Sarah. He saw her properly for the first time, not as a functionary, but as the woman Harrison described. A person with a life, with struggles, with a daughter named Lily. The weight of his casual cruelty became suffocating. "You thought you were a king, Mr. Sterling," Harrison continued, his voice dropping lower. "But a true king understands that his power comes from the well-being of his people. You were a tyrant, and tyrants eventually are always overthrown. I didn't ruin you. I simply took away the props you were using to hide the fact that you were already bankrupt, morally, ethically, and spiritually." Harrison paused, letting the words sink in. "Your father did not disown you because of what you did to Sarah. He disowned you because you got caught, and because it cost him money. Your world was just as hollow as you are. I simply held up a mirror, and it shattered." Richard finally found his voice, a raw, pleading whisper. "What do you want from me? I have nothing left. I'll do anything. I'll work. I'll pay it back somehow." "There is nothing you can do for me," Harrison said sternly, "and you have nothing to offer her that she would ever want." He then turned his gaze to Sarah, and his expression softened completely. "Sarah," he said gently, "this is your decision. What happens now is up to you." The entire cafe seemed to lean in. All eyes were on the waitress. She was no longer invisible. She was the most powerful person in the room. The fate of Richard Sterling, the man who had humiliated her, was now in her hands. Sarah looked at Richard, truly looked at him. She saw the grime, the desperation, the utter self-loathing in his eyes. She saw the scar on her own arm. For a moment she felt a flash of anger, a desire to see him suffer more, to tell him to rot in the hell he had made for himself. But then she thought of her daughter, Lily. She was trying to teach Lily to be kind, to be compassionate, even when others were not. What would she tell Lily she had done in this moment? Would she say she had kicked a man when he was already destroyed? Her gaze softened. The fear was gone, replaced by a profound and weary sadness for the sheer waste of it all. She took a slow breath. "I don't want anything from you," she said, her voice quiet but clear, directed at Richard. "I don't hate you. I feel sorry for you." Then she did something no one expected. She turned to the service counter. "Can I get a coffee and a turkey sandwich to go?" she asked her co-worker. A few moments later, she returned with a paper bag and a cup with a lid on it. She walked over to Richard, who was still standing in a defeated slump. She held out the bag. He stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. He didn't understand. "Take it," she said softly. "You look hungry." He slowly, hesitantly, reached out a trembling hand and took the bag. His fingers brushed against hers, and he flinched, pulling his hand back as if burned. The simple human contact was too much for him to bear. "Go," Sarah said, not with malice, but with a finality that was absolute. "Just go and try to be a better person." Richard clutched the bag to his chest like a holy relic. He looked from her face to Harrison's. He opened his mouth to say something, perhaps another apology, perhaps a thank you, but no words came out. There was nothing left to say. He turned and walked out of the Gilded Spoon. The little bell chimed his exit. This time, no one gasped. They just watched him go, a ghost returning to the wilderness. He didn't look back. The murmur of conversation slowly returned to the cafe, but the atmosphere was changed. Alistair Harrison took a sip of his tea and looked at Sarah with deep paternal pride. "You have a good heart, Sarah Jenkins," he said quietly. She just nodded, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of pain or fear, but of a strange, complicated release. The debt, in its own way, had been paid. Richard Sterling did not know how long he walked. He moved through the city streets like a man in a trance, the paper bag clutched in his hand. The city was the same, the people were the same. But he was fundamentally altered. He was no longer a name, a number in a bank account, or a title on a business card. He was just a man with a sandwich. He eventually found himself back at the small park where he had envied the pigeons. He sat on the same bench, the wood cold beneath him. He opened the bag. Inside was a thick turkey sandwich on whole wheat bread and a black coffee, not scalding but perfectly, comfortingly warm. He took a bite of the sandwich. The taste of simple, honest food was overwhelming. It was nourishment given not in exchange for money, but as an act of grace. An act of grace from the very person he had savaged. Her pity was a more profound condemnation of his actions than all of Harrison's power. Harrison had taken his kingdom, but Sarah had shown him his soul, and it was a barren, impoverished land. He ate slowly, deliberately. Each bite was an act of communion with a humanity he was only just beginning to understand. He drank the coffee, and its warmth spread through his chilled body. It was just a coffee, but it was also a pardon. Not a pardon that absolved him of his sins, but one that granted him permission to start again, from nothing. When he was finished, he carefully placed the wrapper and the empty cup in a nearby trash can. He had no money, no home, no name of any consequence. His past was a wasteland of his own creation, and his future was a terrifying, formless void. For the first time in his life, he had absolutely no idea what he was going to do next. And yet, as he sat on that park bench, watching the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grass, he did not feel the same crushing despair as before. The terror was still there, but it was now tinged with something else, something fragile and new, like the first green shoot pushing its way through scorched earth. It was a flicker of possibility. The fall had been brutal, absolute. He had been brought lower than he ever could have imagined. But in the depths, stripped of everything he thought defined him, he had been forced to find what was actually left. It wasn't much, just a man on a bench with the lingering taste of a simple sandwich and the memory of an unearned kindness. He didn't know if he could ever become a better person. He didn't know if he deserved to. But as he finally stood up and walked away from the bench, heading towards an unknown future, he knew one thing for certain. He would spend the rest of his life trying. He had a long, hard road ahead, a journey that would be measured not in dollars or deals, but in small, difficult steps toward the humanity he had so casually thrown away. And it all began here, with an empty coffee cup and a debt he could never truly repay.